All right, welcome back, sports fans. Today we're going to talk about the Great Depression and why communism doesn't work. You will do some work in your notebook, some responses, some taking of notes. So I'd open that up. I'd at the top write the date, which is 5/11/20, and then I'd title it The Great Depression and Why Communism Doesn't Work. All right, let's get moving. All right, so before we can understand the Great Depression, we have to understand a little bit about how capitalism and stock markets work. So, you guys remember when we talked about exploration, the European exploration of the New World? That's really where capitalism gets its first start as we know it today. You guys talked about the joint stock companies, where basically it's way too expensive for one person to take all the risk of sending out the ship to explore the New World, especially because those ships often ran into storms or sank or got lost and never heard from again. So if you were one person doing that, you would lose all your money and quickly go bankrupt. But the way they did it is you can get 20, 30, 40 people to invest and have a certain percentage of that ship, and then they can all take the risk together. Also, if you run into problems and need money, you can sell your shares to someone else. So that's kind of how the stock market works today. A stock, which is something I'd write down in your little notebook, is a way companies raise money by selling a share of any profits they might have. So if I formed a bicycle repair shop and I needed some extra capital to buy a bunch of equipment so I can fix bikes, I might sell out shares of my company to you guys. And Soleimani might put in, he'll buy 10% of it. I get the money, so I get to start making my business expand. And then Soleimani is going to win because he's going to take 10% of anything that I make. So he's got to believe in me. All right, so as there came to be more and more stocks, you start to get a stock market. A stock market is that area where people can buy and sell those stocks. So if Soleimani needs to make some money because he wants to invest in Poulter's McDonald's franchise, then what he's going to do is sell my stock to, say, Yardley and move his money over there. So the stock market becomes a place where people can kind of buy and sell stocks. And so what they're really doing in a way is kind of gambling on companies. Which companies are going to go up, which companies are going to go down. So this stock market's a great thing. You really wouldn't be able to have new businesses and capitalism without it. But it can be a problem because people, as you know, anybody who gets involved with gambling's probably fine if you're just playing fantasy football. But if you start getting involved in some excessive gambling, you get to have issues. I have a personal note with that. I have a younger brother who is in Gamblers Anonymous. He has kind of massive gambling problems. He just can't stop gambling. And that's kind of a similar thing to what happened with the Great Depression. And it all kind of comes down to this thing called margin trading, which you'd want to write down. So margin trading got popular as people got to have this concept that you could get rich just playing the stock market. You didn't actually have to do anything, make anything, even know much about companies. You were just betting on things going up and down. And what people started doing is they started doing that when they didn't even have the money. So what they would do is go to a broker who would kind of lend them money so that they could invest it, and they assume that if the broker charges 4% interest and they make 10% interest on their investment, that they're going to make money in the end. So more and more people got involved in this margin trading where they don't actually even have the money to afford the stock, but everybody said the stock market can only go up, can only go up, can only go up, and that turned out to not be true. So I'd want to write this down. This is October 1929, so almost 100 years ago. The stock market suddenly plunged. There were all kinds of companies that weren't really worth what they were worth. People were just kind of betting on money on them and upping the price and upping the price. And so the stock market plunged in one day. It was worth, in October, in one day it dropped like 10%, and over the whole month it dropped like 90%. So all of a sudden, all these people who had all their money in the stock market went all the way to the bottom. And the real issue was those margin traders because they didn't even have the money to pay it back. So that creates problems because when they can't pay it back, then the people who loan them money are going to lose money, and it kind of has a spiral effect. This spiral effect also happened all over the world. We talked yesterday about how after the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans owed France and England and other countries $33 billion. They didn't have that money. So what they had to do is borrow for the United States and these banks. So as things go poor in the United States, this is going to have huge problems all over the world. Because, for example, let's start right here. U.S. investors have little or no money to invest abroad. So if they can't do that, then these European nations can't loan money from them. So when they can't loan money from them, things start going bad in their economy, so they stop being able to make goods, which means their workers don't have any money, so they can't buy American goods, which means American goods are gonna go down, and then they have even less money. So this thing kind of cycles and cycles and makes everything worse. I can show you an example here. So I've created a scenario. So we have a factory owner of a bike manufacturing company. He employs 200 people. This is what he has in savings. He's also invested in stocks, and he owes the bank $15,000 because he's trading on margins. This business owner is similar with a family hardware store. He has his brother working, 3 other people. Then there's a worker who's working at this bicycle company, and there's an accountant who has 2 workers, and he serves both of these. So let's see what happens as this stock market crash happens. So first of all, this guy went from $25,000 down to $2,500 that are invested in stocks. So now all of a sudden he owes the bank $15,000, and he only really has $7,500, and he can only make about $100 a month. So he's not going to be able to pay that off. So he's going to have to declare bankruptcy. He's going to close his bicycle manufacturing company, which is going to have issues. So if you're his worker down here, you had $100 in savings. You only had monthly expenses of $20. You were making $5 a month. All of a sudden, you have no income whatsoever. So you are all going to need a new job. You could make it for probably 5 months with your savings, but then you're going to be in trouble because you're going to not have any money. All right, so let's look at this business owner. So they had $10,000 invested in stocks, and they dropped down to, remember, it dropped 90%, so he's down to $1,000. So he owes the bank $3,000, but he has $3,000. But that's going to wipe out everything, especially because with this hardware store, one of his big clients was this bike manufacturing company. So all of a sudden, his income is down. So he's now not even making money every month. So his son's not going to college anymore, and he's going to have to lay off maybe his brother, lay off some of his other people. So even people who didn't have that much invested in the stock market also got hurt. So this accountant down here is another guy. So he had nothing to do, wasn't really super invested in stocks, but because his 2 clients went out of business, he all of a sudden only has $10 invested in stocks. He's not getting any income. He's going to have to start firing his employees. Eventually, he may have to close his accounting business. So this kind of shows that one person making a bad choice or a few people making bad choices can really impact down the line more and more and more. And if you think about it, this accountant suddenly isn't going to be buying groceries. He may have to sell his house, may have to move to a smaller apartment. So all of these things have an impact. So I want you to take a second, and I want you to write in your notebook, kind of a quick write. I want you to take 3 to 5 minutes, really write this out. Take some time. Even if you have to set a timer to do this, make sure that you take your time. So there's a bunch of parallels between the coronavirus economy and the Great Depression. Right now, unemployment is at its highest level since the Great Depression. All kinds of people are out of work, and that has impacts like we just looked at. So I want you to take a second, and you can either talk about this in 2 ways. You can talk about it how, pick a business and how it's closing and talk about how that might impact people. So think about that first layer, then that second layer, that third layer of impact. If you know someone specifically who's dealing with this and you feel like you want to share that, you could be much more specific and say, my uncle, and then explain how everything happens. You don't have to use full sentence for this, but I want you to actually take some time and really invest in doing this. All right, I'm going to pause this for about 5 seconds. You want to pause the video. When you come back, we'll move on to talk about some other things. All right, and we're back. Let's move on. Okay, so it's not moving on. So one of the things that happens here is it's called a bank run. So as people during the Great Depression, businesses start failing. People who loan money from banks to do margin trading start not having it. People start to run out of confidence that the bank has their money. When a bank takes your money and puts it in, they don't just put it in a back room. What they do is they invest it out. So if Shlomo puts $200 into the bank, they're not just holding on to it. They're loaning that out to Avrumi for his business and making a loan so that someone else can buy a house. So it isn't all in the bank. So if everybody wants their money at the same time, the bank isn't going to have it. So this is from a great movie called Mary Poppins. This is a concept of a bank run. Let's get this playing.
Give it back! Give me back the money!
Michael, behave.
So this little boy wants his money back from a banker. and he decides to steal it from the old man.
There's something wrong. The bank won't give someone their money. Well, I'm going to get mine. Come along, young man. Every penny in your...
So it takes a few people saying they want their money back, and all of a sudden everybody's worried. And you see people start pushing. Sometimes banks would try to close and shut down and not pay out. But this just causes more and more panic because people start to think the bank is going to go under. So you see everybody outside rushing up and trying to get in. And you can hold the door shut, but they're going to come in. And right now you've got what is basically a riot of people trying to pull their money out. All because everyone panics when this one little boy has a problem.
Children, come back. Stop those children, James. Michael.
All right, a movie worth watching. Let's move on. Okay, so as we talked about, Germany owed reparations. They borrowed a ton of money to pay from U.S. banks. The big thing you look at in Germany is this is the unemployment rate. So throughout this, even during the war, unemployment's right around 5%, 4%. And that's pretty typical. The United States has been about 4 or 5% for quite some time. And then once the war ends and the Great Depression kind of starts, you start seeing this unemployment rate skyrocket. So it's up to 30% by the time you hit about 1932, 1933. And that number doesn't, what that number means is that 30% of everybody in the country isn't working. So that doesn't include, that also includes children and people who are elderly and retired. So when you think about it, it's not even 30%. It's like 60 to 70% of people who you'd expect to be working are not working. And that's why we have Hitler here. Hitler, we'll talk about this tomorrow, but Hitler would not have come to power if it wasn't for this massive depression. That people are willing to look to kind of weird, strange people when things are going weird and strange. That Hitler's ideas, which were very out there, suddenly seemed like they might be the only way to get things back to normal. All right, and as you'll see, one of the things he does do is he did drop that unemployment rate. You'll learn about how tomorrow, but I just want you to think about that as a context for World War II, that without the Great Depression, you don't get World War II. All right, I want you to take a second and write something else. There's 3 countries we're going to kind of look at. This is Italy here. This is a guy named Benito Mussolini. This is in Germany, obviously. You have Adolf Hitler, and this is in Japan. So these are propaganda posters for all 3 of them. What I want you to do is take a second and just quickly jot down your notebook. What are the things that you see in common across the 3? What are the things that all 3 of them have, that all 3 of them focus on? Or maybe there's one of them you see that there's something a little different. Just take a minute and write that down. You'll also want to write down this definition. It is fascism, which is what we're going to be talking about. And basically what it is it's a political system that says the nation is more important than everything, and it says the only way for the nation to come to power is to have this dictator take charge and run things. So either Mussolini or Hitler, or in Japan it was a series of generals and naval admirals who took power, but what they often do is they create enemies who are to blame for problems. So if things aren't going well, this person who's in charge is going to say, well, it's the fault of this, and if we just do this, then we will win. So there's kind of a shirking of responsibility. So take a second, look at these posters, write things down. All right, so I want to move to one more thing before we jump into finally why communism doesn't work. So here we have communism and fascism. This is kind of the political thing. You hear people talk about being on the left or being on the right. You've probably heard Donald Trump to call, Obama a socialist lefty, and people call people right-wing fascists. This is what it is. There's this spectrum of politics, and there's fascism on the end of one side, which is right-wing, and then you'd get conservatism, so Republicans would be somewhere in here, and Democrats would be somewhere in here, and then you get out to like Bernie Sanders, and then to communism. So communism's far on the left, and you remember we talked about this on last week with Karl Marx, that he had this concept that there was this middle class that was becoming too dictatorial, that was taking over, and that the workers would rise up. And on some hand, that makes sense. It kind of seems like, a bunch of people are living in squalor. You saw the pictures. communism should make sense. All the workers will get a part of the prize. It seems fair. If we were to divide up candy in our classroom and figure out who gets it, you wouldn't want me to get more because I'm, the teacher. You would want everyone to get the same amount of candy, or you'd want some sort of a merit-based system where everybody got some. So communism seems like it works, but we're going to look into why it doesn't, why it tends to fail. Vladimir Lenin's the guy who takes charge. He's going to show you what happens. All right, so let's create a situation for this. So let's make our Lenin will be Mr. K. So here's the best picture I can find of Mr. K. I think it's kind of great. So let's pretend Mr. K. One of the things that socialism does is it sets the number of goods that are going to be made. So in capitalism, we make the number of toasters that people will buy, and companies can change that as it goes along. But that sets it up so that there are people who are winning and people are losing, that you have to have that entrepreneurship. Socialism tries to take out that entrepreneur who's going to make all the money and give it to the workers. So what socialism does is it says, we're going to have the same amount of goods made, the government's going to decide what those goods are, and then they're going to decide on the prices. So in our universe, Mr. K says, we've got M&Ms, we've got Mike and Ike, I'm going to make 1,000 of each. We're going to sell them all for $1. Everyone will be happy. And if that is what people want, then it's happy. If half of the school wants M&Ms, half of the school wants Mike and Ike's, they both have the desire to buy those at $1, everyone's going to be happy. But that doesn't happen all the time. So let's pretend that the actual demand is people really like M&Ms way more than Mike and Ike's. So people wanted 2,000 M&Ms, that's how much people were willing to buy, and only 500 Mike and Ike's. So if we do that, we're going to have issues because half the people are going to get their M&Ms and they're going to get it at a cheap price and they're going to be happy, but the other half are going to be sad. And over here, you're only going to have half the people happy. You're also going to have 500 Mike and Ike's left over. Maybe some of these people will buy Mike and Ike's, but if they really don't like them, then they're going to be upset. So you're going to start to get these inefficiencies that grow. So I'd write this down under reasons communism doesn't work. Bad reason number one. If the person in charge gets the numbers wrong, you're going to end up with too much of some things, too little of others, and people are going to feel upset. And if you think about it, it's got to be hard to be that person in charge and just guess what people are going to like. Everyone knows that there are certain fads that run through and products that suddenly become popular, and if the person in charge doesn't guess that, which would be impossible to be able to do, then you're going to have problems and inefficiencies. All right, so let's also talk about another bad thing that happens. So in our scenario where all of a sudden there's all of these M&Ms that people want to buy and there aren't quite enough, and there's too many Mike and Ike's, there might be a person who comes along. Let's call that person Shabzi. So Shabzi comes along and thinks, hey, I've got a great idea. I'm going to buy up a ton of the M&Ms. And then I'm going to sell them for $2 because that will make people will be willing to pay that because they really want the M&Ms and they know there isn't enough. So Shabzi's going to make a bunch of money, but what you're really creating at that point is a black market. That Shabzi's taken things out of that normal way of doing things and he's brought it to the side. And he's also probably going to have to bribe Mr. K to be able to get some of these M&Ms because Mr. K might notice if he buys them all. So you're going to have that, or he might be stealing them from a store. So these inefficiencies lead people to become greedy, and they get corrupt, and they start using black markets. So that's a bad reason number two for socialism. All right, let's switch it around. So Mr. K is running a school, and he's got four teachers working for him. I couldn't find Mr. Lutzen, so I replaced him with Joe Mauer. So you've got all four of these, and under communism, everybody's supposed to get the same deal. So everybody's supposed to make the same amount of money. Nobody's making any less. So everyone should be happy. They should all be able to pay for it. No one's going to look around and think, man, I'm not getting a good deal. But that doesn't totally work. Let's pretend that in capitalism, if Joe Mauer came up with a great idea to improve the school, he would get paid more money. But in socialism, he doesn't. So if Joe Mauer is going to have to get out there and come up with this great idea, and he's not going to make any money for it, he's unlikely to come to do what he needs to make it better. And so that makes it so that socialism tends to have problems with innovation, that people are not willing to try as hard to innovate because what is the point? You're not going to get rich. Everybody has a concept they can invent some product and get amazingly rich and wealthy and have the life that they want. Under socialism, that doesn't happen. The only reason to do it would be to make Mr. K happy, and at a certain point, you may not want to do that. The other thing also works. Let's pretend that I, Mr. MP, am pretty useless. If in capitalism, if I'm not doing my job, I get fired, I get no more money. They bring someone else in. Under socialism, I'm guaranteed to keep my job. So at that point, I'm only going to work hard enough to not really upset Mr. K. I'm not going to try to do things well. So bad reason 3 and 4 that we have is, first of all, our workers have no incentive to innovate because they're not getting any personal reward. The only reward you might get is like a medal from Mr. K saying, way to go, Mr. Maurer, you did a great job teaching. But how long are people really going to work for that if it doesn't help their family, it doesn't help their kids, it doesn't help them achieve their dreams? And on the other hand, the people who are lazy are just not going to work because they know that as long as they keep to a very bare minimum, they're probably going to be all right. There's no reason to try to do better. Another way to look at that is with school, that you right now all get grades. So here we have 2 guys who got an A+, one person with an F, one person with a D. Under socialism, basically everyone's guaranteed to get a C. So our leader, Mr. K, says no grades, everybody gets a C. So that's great for these 2 guys in the middle because they're just going to get a C. But they're likely to work even less hard because they know they're going to get a C. And these 2 guys on the end are unlikely to keep trying their hardest because they know that there's no actual reward they're going to get. So that concept of rewards in capitalism is important and doesn't really exist in socialism. All right, so finally we have Mr. K. Mr. K is making all these choices. He's not getting the numbers right. He's got too many Mike and Ikes and not enough M&Ms, and that leads to people getting angry. Now, in capitalism or democracy, these people would vote, and they would replace Mr. K, or Mr. K would make some promises to make some changes, and they would believe him. But in socialism, you don't have that. You've got this person who's got to stay in power, and you've got people who are mad. So the only way to solve that is with armies. So Mr. K starts to have an army to keep people from getting upset while he tries to tinker with and change the amount of Mike and Ikes and M&Ms that are made to make everyone happy. But as he gets that army more and more, he's going to tend to stay in power, and he's going to need force to stay in power. So at that point, your communism has gone from being something where all the workers are supposed to help to Mr. K, our communist leader, our Lenin, needing to rely on force to stay in power. So under Lenin, things were somewhat bad, but it's going to get even worse because Mr. K, after Lenin dies, the person in charge becomes this guy, Joseph Stalin, who we will talk about more during World War II, but he is going to push things to that force concept to a long thing. He does do great things for the economy. He gets all kinds of industrialization moving up, but the way he does it is rough. He sets these 5-year plans where we're going to make this much, we're going to grow the economy this much, everyone's going to pay this much, and you're going to get this kind of toaster and this kind of food and all of that. But the way that he does that is by doing what's called the Great Terror. So Stalin worried constantly that people were going to overthrow him when things didn't go well. So he did in the 1930s this campaign of terror where he resulted in the execution of 700,000 Russians. And most of the people he went after were politicians, which makes sense. He didn't want anybody to step in and become him. And then also military officers because he was worried about them using the army against him. So that's going to be a problem because you generally don't want to try to kill all of your military officers right before you go to war. So here's a short video that talks about the purges. We won't watch all of it, but watch some.
Stalin was acutely paranoid. Everywhere and in everything he saw enemies, double dealers, and spies.
Khrushchev was the guy who followed him in power.
He often wore a bulletproof vest and rode in a bulletproof car. Car routes and railway stations were cleared whenever he traveled. But Stalin saved his most paranoid suspicions for those closest to him. Sergei Kirov, the leader of the Leningrad Soviet, was devoted to the Communist Party. But over time, he began to voice grave concerns about Stalin's brutality. On 1st December 1934, Kirov was shot and killed under Stalin's orders. This event marked the start of a period known as the Great Terror, where Stalin purged the country of any opponents. Secret police were everywhere, digging out suspected antagonists. Those arrested were tortured, executed, or exiled to Siberia. The Great Terror peaked from 1936 to 1938. A series of show trials were held for prominent enemies of the state suspected of opposing Stalin. The first of these was the trial of the 16 in 1936 and accused his old allies Zinoviev and Kamenev. The public prosecutor was Andrei Vyshensky. Evidence was fabricated, and victims were tortured to gain false confessions. One group were even accused of plotting with Trotsky in a hotel that records show had been closed for years.
So these were often on trumped-up evidence. It didn't really exist.
The Community Party itself was a primary target of the purges. Of Lenin's original Central Committee, only one survived: Stalin.
So under Lenin, these were the 25 people who were the most in charge, and Stalin, over about 5-6 years, killed off all the rest of them. It's basically like Game of Thrones, but in real life and with him just having people shot.
The Red Army was also torn apart. 77 of its 88 senior commanders were executed, and half the entire officer corps, along with their wives and children, were shot or imprisoned. This created a staggering void in the military's top command, leaving Russia highly vulnerable.
Which is no problem unless you've got to fight a war coming up.
$8 million people slaved away in the gulags, where the annual death rate was 20%. Life here was appalling. Inmates had to work and sleep outside in the Siberian winter and were fed only scraps of food. At the end of the workday, there were corpses left on the worksite. One of them was hunched over beneath a wheelbarrow. He had his hands in his sleeves and froze to death in that position. Two were frozen back to back, leaning against each other. Ordinary citizens were encouraged to denounce each other, and by 1938, 1 person in every 20 had been arrested. Stalin even had the law altered to allow the execution of children as young as 12. All Russians were living in a state of terror. No one knew who it was safe to talk to. Even the secret police were spying on the secret police. Eventually, after executing hundreds of thousands of Russians, most of Stalin's opponents were dead or imprisoned. In 1939, he called a halt to the purges.
One of the most dangerous positions to have in Russia during this point of time was Stalin's kind of chief executioner, because he would eventually turn on that person and have their subordinate kill them. Those gulags were also a lot like concentration camps when you get down to them. There wasn't the systematic gassing, and it wasn't quite as focused on certain ethnic groups, but Stalin really killed just about as many people as Hitler would eventually. It really is a time of great murder by these huge dictators. Right here is a map that shows all of those gulags, which are those camps. He put these all over Russia. These are places where they would build, places they could get lumber, places that they could dig out minerals. So this helped with the industrialization of Russia. But again, 5% of the population got arrested during this time, and millions of people died. So perhaps not worth it. And what I want you to do is to kind of come back to that concept. When we look at this kind of chart of the right and the left, in reality, it's really a circle when you look down. That there's very little difference between the fascists, who are all the way on the far right, and, say, the communists, who are all the way on the far left. That they all kind of come back to this center spot where it's the one person's in charge, they get to make all the decisions, it's to make the country better, and they'll kill anybody who gets in their way. So when we think about it here, there's a lot of demonization today where Republicans will say Democrats are the worst, and Democrats will say, Donald Trump and the Republicans are the worst. But really, what you need is both of those to keep you near the center, because you never want to keep going too far to the left where you end up in awful, and you really don't want to go too far to the right either, because that's where you start ending up with fascism. You need these two sides kind of playing off of each other. And that's really what America is about, is trying to keep those two in there. So the next time you hear someone saying something awful about Democrats or awful about Republicans, you should really remind them that you need to have those two sets of values in order to keep from ending up with what I love that they call this the lunatic fringe. All right, one other quote here, and then we'll be done. It says, "Do not look in the file of incriminating evidence to see whether or not the accused rose up against the Soviets with arms or words. Ask him instead to which class he belongs, what is his background, his education, his profession. These are the questions that will determine the fate of the accused. That is the meaning and essence of the Red Terror." So basically what they're saying is it doesn't matter whether there's truth or not. All it matters is who you are, who your parents were, where you went to school, who you knew. That if you knew the wrong people, then all of a sudden you became part of this and went down. And that's a secret police officer saying that. That's someone who was in charge of arresting people saying that all of this was super crazy. All right, I want you to take a second here. This is the last thing you'll do. You're going to write a paragraph in your notebook about one of the following, only one. So you want to make sure you have a topic sentence, concluding sentence, 3 to 4 body sentences, and you can pick any of these 4 topics and kind of look back through the video if you need. Otherwise, just depend on your notes. You should be able to talk about this. And so the first one is why communism doesn't work. That was a big part of today. You could talk about that kind of snowball effect and how that created the Great Depression, maybe drawing on some of your notes. You also could talk about margin trading if you really want to focus on why that makes stock markets crash harder. And then also communism, fascism. Why are they similar? Why do people think of them as being on two ends, but they really on the same end are the same? You kind of talk about Hitler and Stalin at that point. So write that out there. I'll get you credit for doing that, and enjoy your life.